Chris Harmer is a retired Navy commander. Chris, I want to talk to you about this because it didn't come up in my mind enough. Some folks did bring it up, but what does this mean for NATO? What does it mean for the security of the European people? Because a lot of people are saying perhaps the biggest winner of all of this, Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, well, Vladimir Putin's losing across the board. I mean, Russia's economy is contracting, population's contracting. There's no sense in which Russia is winning anything other than a short-term positioning victory in Syria. Let me talk briefly about NATO. I've heard a lot of people talk about European security in the context of Brexit. I don't have an opinion on Brexit, yea or nay. I'll simply say that NATO precedes the existence of the European Union by over 4 decades, and NATO itself was an outgrowth of the North American alliance, the UK, the US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, that won World War II. So all this hue and cry about the collapse of European security organizations simply doesn't meet with the facts. I think that NATO is as strong as it's ever been. NATO is perfectly capable of handling external threats. I think where the EU is under pressure and where the EU has failed is dealing with the internal security threat posed by terrorism and the idea that somehow a transnational or pan-European organization of unelected bureaucrats in Brussels was going to adequately address it. Clearly, the EU has failed in that mission. I think NATO's got to take a bigger role.
So then, and that in of itself, because a lot of people are saying, to your point, NATO's been around a long time. It's old. It's antiquated. Its mission statement is in a bygone era, perhaps Cold War era that doesn't exist anymore. So could there be pressure on NATO to sort of revamp its mission statement? And could this sort of, hey, let's go it ourselves, ultimately extend to a treaty like the NATO treaty?
I think that's a valid criticism, one NATO has to take seriously. NATO was built to win the Cold War. It did magnificently at that job. In the post-Cold War environment, NATO sought to transform itself to make itself more relevant. I think NATO still needs further reformation, further transformation. It's got to be more agile in responding to these threats. It's got to look at whether or not there's a role for NATO in playing in the counterterrorism or anti-terrorism role inside of Europe. That violates the current precepts of NATO, which are purely externally focused. Right. They don't deal with any internal police domestic issues. But if NATO is going to remain relevant in the fight against terrorism, they've got to look at that.
All right, Chris Harmer, thank you very much. Really